On June 5, 2012, some 15 months after a devastating tsunami struck Japan, a commercial fisheries dock washed ashore on Agate Beach, 1 mile north of Newport, Oregon, home to Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center. The dock was quickly traced to the coastal town of Misawa, Japan, where the tsunami had dislodged it along with 3 identical docks, and then dragged them out to sea. This was no tiny wooden boat dock. The massive steel and concrete structure weighed 188 tons and measured 66 feet long, 19 feet wide, and 7 feet tall. Filled with styrofoam, it was designed to float, which is what enabled it to make the long journey across the Pacific, nudged along by both the current and the wind. Although the arrival of the dock on this popular Oregon beach was certainly unexpected, eventually drawing an estimated 90,000 visitors to the shore, what was even more surprising were the passengers who had come along for the ride. The surface of the dock was quite simply teeming with life, including seaweeds, barnacles, sea stars, sea urchins, anemones, amphipods, worms, mussels, oysters, clams, snails, and crabs. Working in conjunction with colleagues across the world, scientists from Hatfield are still involved in the painstaking process of identifying all the various species. As of April 13, 2013, some 130 had been identified, 30 species of seaweed and 100 species of marine invertebrates. Of the 130 total species, the scientists classified 119 as not native to the Oregon coast. When walking along this stretch of beach, it's not uncommon to find organisms attached to marine debris. Typically, however, these are pelagic species that hitched a ride while the piece of debris was out at sea. The dock was something altogether different. Only 4 of the species were pelagic. The rest were nearshore species that had fouled the dock when it was still moored in Misawa. It was as if the ocean had lifted an ecological community from one shore and deposited it on another, some 5,000 miles away. The Hatfield scientists were surprised that this subtidal community had been able to survive the long trip across the nutrient-poor open ocean. Soon after arriving on the scene, the scientists identified several potentially invasive species, including wakame, a seaweed used in miso soup that has caused problems in California, but has not become a problem in Oregon yet. The scientists would later identify 2 other especially bad actors, as they called them, the northern Pacific sea star and the Japanese shore crab. As a precautionary measure, managers from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, or ODFW for short, killed all the organisms on the dock. I lived on the Oregon coast in and near Newport from May of 2013 until January of 2014, and then again during spring break this year. I'll be returning to Newport this summer to conduct additional field work. Through interviews with the scientists and managers who were involved in managing the dock, and through an analysis of press coverage, videos, and documents, I've been focusing on 2 main research questions. First, what does it mean to classify these organisms as having been introduced by human action in the face of such overwhelming geological forces as earthquakes and tsunamis? Or in other words, why was this a case of human introduction rather than natural colonization? And what's so unnatural about human action anyhow? What I want to talk about today, however, is my second question, which is more relevant to an audience interested in critical animal studies. With one notable exception, namely 5 small fish who arrived in a boat that washed ashore in Long Beach, Washington, one of whom, nicknamed Sue, is now on display at the Seaside Aquarium in Seaside, Oregon. All the animals who have rafted across the Pacific to date have been invertebrates. What I found through interviews with those involved in managing the dock was that my bringing up the issue of animal welfare was the first time it had come up. Despite the existence of guidelines for the euthanasia of marine invertebrates, and despite recent scientific research suggesting that at least some invertebrates, most notably in this case crabs, may have the capacity to feel pain. This leads to the question I'd like to explore today, namely, how did the scientists and managers in this case think about the moral considerability of the animals on the dock? I'll explore this question by describing to you a key interview I conducted with the ODFW's lead person on invasive species management. Based at ODFW's headquarters in Salem, Oregon, Rick Boatner is the department's Invasive Species Wildlife Integrity Coordinator. Boatner was in Portland at a meeting on invasive quagga and zebra mussels when he got a call from Newport about the dock. On the other end of the line was Steve Rumrell, ODFW's shellfish program leader, who was organizing ODFW's response on the ground. After learning from Rumrell that wakame, among other potentially invasive species, was present on the dock, Boatner's attention immediately focused on neutralizing the threat. Boatner described himself to me as a doom and gloom biologist. I want to kill things. I'm not into protecting things, he said. Over the phone, he and Rumrell came up with a plan to decontaminate the dock. For reasons I can't get into here, a decision was made to lump all the species together for the purposes of management, regardless of the actual level of risk posed by each. The objective was to kill them all, except for those taken as samples. As Boatner later explained to me, I wanted everything dead. That's my job, kill everything. WFW has 2 decon units that it uses to remove potentially invasive species from boats and other watercraft. Workers first scrape organisms from a watercraft, and then the vessel is blasted with a high-pressure jet of hot water to kill any still clinging to the vessel. When the dock landed on Agate Beach, one of the units was in the shop, and the other was way over in eastern Oregon, so ODFW had to improvise. The task of decontaminating the dock fell to Rumrell, who quickly organized the ODFW Marine Resource Japanese Tsunami Marine Debris Non-Native Species Eradication Team. The team consisted of 13 ODFW employees who, like Rumrell, were based in Newport. Rumrell's boss laid down some ground rules for the project. Don't use volunteers, don't spend more than $3,000, and have the work done by the weekend. Work began the morning of Thursday, June 7th, at low tide. They had to work quickly before the tide came in, enabling certain organisms to escape. Equipped with metal shovels and lawn edgers, the team scraped organisms off the top and sides of the dock and placed them into black plastic garbage bags. They couldn't reach the organisms on the bottom of the dock, which was beached in the sand. All told, approximately 4,260 pounds of organisms were removed. A truck hauled the bags above the high tide line, where they were stored temporarily, while a contractor dug a hole in the sand. After the hole had been dug, workers from the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, or OPRD for short, emptied the trash bags into it. Then, for good measure, one of the OPRD workers sprayed the organisms with a gallon of bleach. The contractor filled the hole back in with sand, presumably burying many animals alive, who then died either as a result of the bleach or by hypoxia or desiccation. The ODFW team used propane torches to kill any organisms still clinging to the dock, including those too tiny to see. The work was done by the end of the day. The ODFW workers did have to come back on Friday to remove rubber bumpers from the dock and decontaminate them with the torches as well. In the veterinary world, euthanasia is typically defined as humane killing, or killing an animal with minimal pain and distress, regardless of the reason why the animal is killed. When I asked Boatner whether humane killing is a consideration in the management of invasive species, he told me that it depends upon the species. It's certainly an issue with feral swine, he explained, but he wasn't sure whether there was a humane standard for what he described as mollusk-type species. He told me that ODFW follows the Guidelines for Euthanasia of Non-Domestic Animals, which are published by the American Association of Zoo Veterinarians. I obtained a copy through the Hatfield Library. Interestingly enough, there's a whole chapter on how to euthanize invertebrates. Written by Michael J. Murray, a veterinarian at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, the chapter focuses on marine invertebrates. Murray describes acceptable methods of euthanizing sponges, comb jellies, corals, anemones, snails, slugs, sea hare, clams, mussels, oysters, octopi, squid, cuttlefish, segmented worms, crabs, lobsters, insects, spiders, sea stars, urchins, and sea cucumbers, some of the very species that were found on the dock. The guidelines acknowledge that it's not always practical to use the most acceptable method to kill an animal, particularly when you're in the field, rather than in a lab or an aquarium. According to the guidelines, in a field setting, the goal should be to minimize pain and distress as much as possible under the circumstances. In the case of the dock, the acceptability of the methods used to kill the animals never even came up. The scientists and managers didn't decide that humane killing was impractical. Rather, as Boatner put it, the issue of humane killing wasn't even on our radar screen. Part of the reason was the nature of the animals themselves. They were, after all, invertebrates. As Boatner put it, animal welfare hadn't come up, quote, mostly because they were lower species, plant, algae, barnacles, things you don't even think about. Now, if a seal had jumped on there, that would have been a different story, probably because of the classification of these animals as lower species, not a higher species, end quote. Boatner had trouble explaining what he meant by higher and lower organisms. This was clearly tacit knowledge for him. When pressed, however, he did offer this distinction, quote, higher would be a mammal. They're something I can relate to. They have a heart, brain, big brain, everything like that. The lower class, They're just the lower class. They're just one-cell animals or